Parker hated October. Most people in Millbrook, Ohio, loved it. They loved the cool mornings, the leaves turning gold, and the smell of cinnamon drifting out of every coffee shop in town. Linda didn't. To her, October smelled like hospital hallways and bad news. 3 years earlier, on a gray October morning, her husband Tom had died. 34 years of marriage had somehow been reduced to an old leather jacket hanging in the closet, a coffee mug she couldn't bring herself to throw away, and the habit of setting the dinner table for two before remembering she only needed one plate. People always talk about the silence that follows loss. But Linda had learned something different. The hardest part wasn't the silence. The hardest part was the habits. The extra cup of coffee. The second pillow on the bed. The apple pie she still bought every Friday because Tom had loved apple pie more than any grown man probably should. Some habits survive longer than people do. Every Friday after work, Linda drove to the same grocery store on the edge of town. Same parking lot. Same shopping cart with the crooked wheel. Same loaf of bread. Same coffee. Same little apple pie she never actually finished eating. That Friday, she loaded the groceries into her old Ford and turned the key. The engine coughed, complained, made one final dramatic sound, and quit. "Oh, don't start with me today," Linda sighed. "I'm afraid we're a little past that point." She turned around. A tall man wearing a faded baseball cap stood beside a golden retriever who looked genuinely concerned about the situation. "Judging by that sound," the man continued, "I'd say your car has officially entered hospice care." Linda laughed despite herself. The man held out his hand. "Frank Miller." He pointed at the dog. "And this is Max. He's in charge of emotional support." "And what exactly are you in charge of?" "The heavy lifting while he takes all the credit." Max wagged his tail as if this arrangement had been working perfectly for years. For the first time in a very long while, Linda laughed. A real laugh. Not the polite kind people use when they're trying to convince everyone they're doing fine. A real one. And somehow that scared her almost as much as the broken car. After that, they started running into each other far too often to call it coincidence. Frank showed up at the library where Linda worked with increasingly ridiculous excuses. One afternoon, he checked out a book about American lighthouses. "You interested in lighthouses?" Linda asked. "Not even a little." "Then why borrow the book?" I panicked. Another day, he asked for books about growing roses. Unfortunately for Frank, the entire town knew that every plant he touched died within a week. Even cacti were nervous around him. Then there was the cinnamon roll incident. Max stole Linda's pastry straight off the cafe table and swallowed half of it before anyone could react. Frank shrugged. He has a gift. For stealing baked goods? For bringing lonely people together. Linda raised an eyebrow. "Your dog is a matchmaker? The best one in Ohio." Then something happened that only seems to happen in movies. Linda got a call from a lawyer in Boston. He spoke slowly, politely, and with a kind of voice that immediately makes you nervous. "Mrs. Parker, I need to discuss the estate of Mr. Robert Harper." "You have the wrong person."
"No, ma'am."
"I've checked the paperwork several times." A week later, she found herself sitting in an office overlooking Boston Harbor, staring at an envelope with her name written across the front. Robert Harper. She had never heard that name before in her life. Still, her hands were shaking. Inside was a letter. "Dear Linda, if you're reading this, then once again, I ran out of courage before I ran out of time. I wasn't there for your first steps. I wasn't in the audience when you graduated. I didn't walk you down the aisle on your wedding day. But there wasn't a single year of your life when I didn't know how you were doing. Because I am your father." Linda read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, as if maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something else. They didn't. At 56 years old, she discovered that half her story belonged to a man she'd never met. Her mother had loved Robert before she met William Parker. Then came Vietnam. Months without letters. Then the telegrams saying Robert Harper was missing in action. And eventually there was William.
Kind.
Reliable. The man who taught Linda how to ride a bike and sat through every painfully bad middle school flute concert she ever performed. By the time Robert came home, Linda's mother already had a husband and a little girl. So everyone agreed to leave the past where it belonged. Everyone except Robert. He didn't disappear. He simply stepped aside and loved his daughter quietly from a distance for the rest of his life. The house in Boston sat near the ocean. It was small, weathered, the kind of house that looked like it had stories tucked into every corner. The attic was full of boxes.
Dozens of them.
Every single one labeled with Linda's name. Linda, first grade. Linda, high school graduation. Linda and Tom, wedding. Linda and Emily, Christmas 1998. There were newspaper clippings, photographs, school programs, even a tiny newspaper article announcing that Linda Parker had won the county apple pie contest in 1984. She sat on the attic floor surrounded by those boxes and cried. Not because she had lost a father, because somehow she had found a love she never knew existed. There is a special kind of heartbreak in discovering someone loved you your entire life while remaining a stranger. Frank never pushed her to talk. He just quietly showed up. One evening, he brought soup after she stopped answering her phone. Another day, he fixed the gate that had been squeaking for years. Then, he replaced the porch light. Sometimes, he simply sat beside her on the steps while leaves blew across the yard. One evening, she finally spoke. "You know what bothers me most?"
What?
He knew my favorite color. She looked down at her coffee. He knew when I graduated college. He knew when I got married. He knew when Emily was born. She swallowed hard. And I don't even know if he drank coffee or tea. Frank was quiet for a moment. "Maybe that's why he left you the house." She looked at him. "So you could get to know him through the things he left behind." A few weeks later, Linda returned to Boston. This time she wasn't rushing. She opened closets, sorted through books, looked through photographs, trying to build a picture of a man from the pieces he had left behind. In the kitchen, she found an old cookbook. Inside were handwritten notes. "Too much cinnamon. Lower the oven temperature next time. Almost as good as Mary's cookies." Linda smiled. Her mother used to leave notes and recipes too. For a strange moment, she wondered if maybe she and Robert had been more alike than she ever realized. On the last page, she found an old photograph of Robert standing beside a backyard grill. On the back, he had written, "I never did learn how to cook, but I kept trying, just in case Linda ever showed up for one of my barbecues someday." Linda sat there holding the photograph for a very long time. Sometimes one sentence is enough to make you grieve an entire life that never got the chance to happen. When she returned home, she found Frank and Max in her front yard. Well, Frank was working. Max was supervising. "What's happening here?" she asked. "Emergency rescue operation." "What kind of rescue operation?" "Your roses have officially gone on strike and requested professional intervention." Linda stared at the flower bed. "Frank, those were chrysanthemums." "Were. Exactly why we're here." She laughed so loudly that Mrs. Wilson peeked through her curtains next door to see what was going on. Later that evening, they sat on the porch drinking hot chocolate while Max lay at their feet looking exhausted by the responsibility of managing their emotional lives. "You know," Linda said quietly, "I keep thinking about all the things we never get the chance to say to people." Frank nodded slowly. "I think about that every day." She looked at him. "That's why I stopped putting important things off." "Like what?" "Like inviting one very stubborn woman to the Christmas market next Saturday." "And if she says no?" Then I'll send in my negotiator. He nodded toward Max. The retriever lifted his head and wagged his tail. For the first time in years, Linda felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time.
Hope.
Not fireworks, not a fairy tale, just the quiet feeling that maybe something good was waiting for her around the corner. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. At the Christmas market, Frank lost a ring toss game to an 8-year-old boy and spent the next 30 minutes insisting the kid had somehow cheated. Max received a free dog biscuit from one of the vendors and became even more convinced of his own irresistible charm. And somewhere between the Christmas lights, the smell of roasted pecans, and Frank arguing with a child over carnival rules, Linda realized something. For hours she hadn't thought about the past, or loss, or regrets, or the letters waiting for her back in Boston. She was simply laughing, living, watching the lights come alive over the town square. And for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of Christmas coming. Christmas Eve arrived cold and quiet. Then the doorbell rang. Standing on her porch were Frank and Max. The dog proudly carried a box of Christmas ornaments in his mouth and looked very pleased with himself. "We're here to make sure you're not violating Ohio state law regarding solitary Christmas celebrations," Frank announced. Linda smiled. "That's not a real law." "It is now." "Who passed it?" Frank pointed at Max. "The legislature met about 10 minutes ago." Later that night, Linda stood beside the Christmas tree looking at 3 photographs. In the first, Tom smiled back at her. In the second was Robert, the father she never got the chance to hug. And in the third stood Linda, Frank, and Max, who looked directly into the camera with the expression of a man who knew he'd successfully managed another matchmaking assignment. Linda touched the frames gently. Life sometimes takes people away too soon. Sometimes it gives them back too late. And sometimes, just when you think all the important moments are already behind you, life sends you an old mechanic, an overly confident golden retriever, and a letter that waited 50 years to be opened.